Lieutenant James Carter's fingers drummed lazily against the steering wheel as he cruised down Cedar Grove's main strip. The streetlights cast intermittent shadows across his Army uniform, still crisp despite the long day of training exercises and administrative duties. His new silver SUV, a reward to himself for his recent promotion, purred smoothly as it rolled past the darkened storefronts of the sleeping town. The digital clock on his dashboard blinked 11:07 p.m. The late hour meant empty streets, just the way he liked it. No traffic, no complications, just a peaceful drive home to his apartment where a shower and his comfortable bed awaited. The radio hummed softly, playing some forgotten 90s tune that made him think of his childhood. As he approached the intersection of Maple and Fifth, a quick glance in his rearview mirror caught the sudden flash of red and blue lights. Carter checked his speedometer, 32 in a 35 zone. His turn signals were working. He'd just used them 2 blocks back. The registration was current, insurance up to date. A familiar tension crept into his shoulders, the same one he'd felt during similar stops over the years. Following procedure, both military and civilian, Carter activated his right turn signal and pulled into the well-lit gas and go parking lot. The fluorescent lights eliminated any shadows, and the store's security cameras would have a clear view of whatever was about to unfold. He'd learned these precautions years ago, back when his father first taught him how to handle police encounters. The patrol car stopped at an angle behind him, its spotlight suddenly flooding his mirrors with blinding light. Carter kept his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, visible through the rear window. Through his side mirror, he watched Officer Michael Reynolds emerge from the patrol car, his hand already resting on his holstered weapon. The officer's approach was tense, tactical, more suited for a felony stop than a routine traffic violation. "Driver, roll down your window," Reynolds barked, his voice carrying an edge that set off warning bells in Carter's mind. Carter pressed the window control, lowering it exactly 3 inches, enough to communicate clearly while maintaining a safety barrier. "Good evening, officer," he said, keeping his voice steady and professional. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" "Your license plate is missing," Reynolds snapped, his flashlight beam sweeping aggressively across Carter's face. "I need to see your license and registration." Carter's jaw tightened slightly. He'd personally attached the license plate 2 weeks ago, and he'd checked all his lights and plates before leaving the base, a military habit he'd never broken. "Sir, I believe there must be some mistake. My license plate is properly mounted and clearly visible." "Don't tell me how to do my job." Reynolds' voice rose sharply. "Show me your hands. Keep them where I can see them." "My hands are on the steering wheel, officer," Carter replied calmly, even as his heart rate accelerated. Through his driver's side mirror, he could see the store clerk inside watching the scene unfold, phone in hand. "I'm Lieutenant James Carter, U.S. Army, stationed at Fort Bell. I want to comply with your commands, but I need clear instructions on how you'd like me to proceed." Reynolds' flashlight beam trembled slightly, creating dancing shadows across the car's interior. "I said show me your hands. Step out of the vehicle. Stay in the car. Don't move." The contradictory commands hung in the air like smoke, and Carter felt the situation spiraling. His military training screamed that something was very wrong, while his lifetime of civilian experience as a black man in America told him the next few moments could change, or end, his life. The gas station's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Carter processed Reynolds' conflicting commands. His phone sat in the center console, its screen dark but camera recording. Another lesson his father had taught him. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool night air seeping through the partially opened window. "Officer Reynolds," Carter tried again, reading the nameplate clearly visible on the officer's chest. "I'm going to narrate my movements before I make them. I'm keeping my right hand on the steering wheel and reaching very slowly with my left hand toward the center console where my registration is stored." His measured tone contrasted sharply with Reynolds' escalating agitation. "I said don't move," Reynolds shouted, his flashlight beam jerking erratically across the car's interior. The officer's free hand had moved from his holster to his utility belt, fingers dancing near his pepper spray canister. "You're not listening to commands." Inside the gas and go, the night clerk, Mohammed Patel, had already pressed the silent alarm and was openly filming with his phone. Two customers stood frozen by the coffee machine, their own phones raised like shields against the unfolding scene. Carter felt his military training and survival instincts warring inside his mind. The lieutenant in him wanted to take control of the situation, to impose order on chaos. But the black man who'd grown up in America knew that asserting any kind of authority could be fatal. "Officer, I'm not moving. My hands are visible. I'm a commissioned officer in the United States Army, and I'm trying to comply with your instructions. Please tell me clearly what you want me to do." Reynolds' response came in the form of a sharp crack as he slammed his flashlight against the driver's side window. "Stop resisting. Exit the vehicle now. Stay where you are." The contradictions in his commands grew more frantic with each passing second. Through his side mirror, Carter caught a glimpse of a second patrol car pulling into the gas station, its lights silent. Hope for a voice of reason flickered briefly, until he saw the new officer take Reynolds' cue and draw their weapon as well. Last warning. Reynolds' voice had taken on a strange, high-pitched quality. "Show me your hands. Don't move. Stop resisting." Carter's lips moved in silent prayer as he kept his hands perfectly still on the steering wheel. The silver oak leaves on his uniformed shoulders caught the flashlight's beam, reflecting it back like tiny mirrors. He thought of his mother, of her constant warnings about being too confident, too assured in the protection his uniform might offer. The pepper spray canister appeared in Reynolds' hand like a magic trick. There was no time to close the window, no time to shield his face. The burning stream shot through the narrow opening, filling the car's interior with liquid fire. Carter's world exploded into pain and reflexive panic. His training kicked in. Don't rub your eyes, control your breathing, maintain situational awareness. But biology betrayed training as his body fought against the chemical assault. Tears streamed down his face, mucus poured from his nose, and his lungs seized as if he were drowning in open air. Through the burning haze, Carter heard car doors slamming, boots on pavement, and Reynolds screaming about a suspect resisting arrest. His phone kept recording from its quiet perch in the console, capturing every second of what was quickly becoming a national flashpoint, though none of them knew it yet. Mohammed Patel's hands trembled as he uploaded the video to Twitter. The timestamp read 2:47 a.m., but sleep was the furthest thing from his mind. He'd spent the last 3 hours giving his statement to internal affairs investigators who'd arrived shortly after Lieutenant Carter was taken to the hospital. The caption he typed was simple: "Army officer pepper sprayed during traffic stop at my store. He did nothing wrong. #police brutality." By sunrise, the video had already amassed over 100,000 views. The store's security footage, which Mohammed had also provided to Carter's family, offered 4 different angles of the incident. National news networks were running both videos side by side in an endless loop, their commentary growing increasingly heated with each replay. Carter sat in his hospital room, eyes still raw and burning, watching his own trauma play out on the mounted TV. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since being returned to him after his release from custody. Calls from military brass, civil rights attorneys, news anchors, and fellow service members poured in. But it was his mother's voicemail that finally broke him. "Baby, this is exactly what I always feared. Please tell me you're okay." At Fort Bell, Carter's commanding officer, Colonel Sarah Martinez, stood before a phalanx of reporters who had gathered at the base entrance. "Lieutenant Carter represents the best of our armed forces," she declared, her voice tight with controlled anger. "The idea that one of our officers could be treated this way while in uniform is beyond unacceptable. We stand firmly behind him." Inside the Cedar Grove Police Department, Chief Robert Wilson watched the view counter on the viral video tick upward with alarming speed. His email inbox filled with demands for comment from every major news outlet in the country. On his desk, Lay Officer Reynolds' personnel file, its contents now being scrutinized by journalists who had already filed multiple Freedom of Information Act requests. The city's mayor had called an emergency meeting, but Wilson's mind kept returning to a conversation from 3 months ago, when Reynolds' partner had filed a confidential complaint about his increasingly erratic behavior. The complaint had been buried, marked as internal personnel matter. Now that decision felt like a ticking time bomb. Social media exploded with new hashtags. Hashtag Justice for Old Carter. Hashtag Service Not Service. Hashtag Uniform Not Unarmed. Celebrity activists amplified the story, sharing it with millions of followers. Each post brought a new wave of scrutiny to Cedar Grove, a town that had never faced the national spotlight. Carter's fellow officers from his unit began organizing a peaceful protest, planning to march in uniform from Fort Bell to the police station. Military veterans from across the country announced plans to join them. The story had struck a particular nerve. If a uniformed lieutenant could be treated this way, what chance did ordinary citizens have? By nightfall, less than 24 hours after the incident, media satellite trucks lined Cedar Grove's Main Street. Mohammed's gas station had become an impromptu gathering place, with supporters leaving flowers and letters for Carter. Among them was an anonymous note from within the police department itself. "Some of us want to speak up. We're gathering evidence. This isn't the first time." In his apartment, finally alone after being discharged from the hospital, Carter watched his phone screen light up with yet another call, this time from the governor's office. As he reached to answer it, his hand passed through the beam of a news helicopter's searchlight filtering through his window, illuminating the oak leaves on his uniform, still hanging on the back of his chair, unwashed and bearing traces of pepper spray. Detective Sarah Chen stared at the stack of complaints on her desk, each manila folder telling a piece of Officer Reynolds' history that Internal Affairs had conveniently overlooked. As the newly appointed lead investigator from the state police, she'd spent the past week uncovering a pattern that made her stomach churn. Her hand paused over a folder dated 3 years ago. Another traffic stop, another minority driver, another instance of excessive force marked unfounded. Down the hall, Chief Wilson sat in his office, watching protest signs wave through his window while on a conference call with the police union representative. "We can't protect him this time, Jim," Wilson said, his voice heavy. "The FBI just served us with a warrant for all of Reynolds' body camera footage from the past 5 years. They're looking into a pattern of civil rights violations." Officer Diane Martinez, Reynolds' former partner, fidgeted with her badge as she waited outside the Internal Affairs office. After 2 years of silence, she'd finally decided to come forward. Her written statement burned in her pocket. Detailed accounts of Reynolds' escalating behavior, the racial slurs muttered under his breath, the unnecessary stops of minority drivers. She documented everything, even after her initial complaint was buried. In the evidence room, IT specialist Kevin Park discovered something disturbing. Gaps in Reynolds' body camera footage, always occurring during controversial stops. But the metadata told a different story. The cameras didn't malfunction, he explained to Detective Chen. Someone manually deleted segments using an administrator password. He pushed forward a list of timestamps and login credentials that led straight to a senior supervisor. Carter's legal team, led by civil rights attorney Marcus Thompson, sat in a downtown conference room reviewing the mounting evidence. "It's not just Reynolds," Thompson explained to Carter. "We're looking at a systematic failure of oversight. Every level of leadership turned a blind eye." He spread photos across the table. Other officers who'd reported Reynolds, only to be transferred or passed over for promotion. Anonymous letters from within the department continued to arrive at local news stations. One contained a recording of a roll call meeting from 6 months ago, Reynolds making racially charged jokes, while supervisors laughed. Another included documentation of minority officers being assigned to the most dangerous beats after filing complaints. At home, Reynolds' wife Dana sat at their kitchen table, reading years of performance reviews that praised her husband's proactive policing, while ignoring red flags. She thought about the changes she'd noticed in him, The increasing anger, the racial comments, the way he'd grip his gun while watching the news. Her hand trembled as she dialed Carter's attorney's office. The investigation expanded beyond Reynolds. Detective Chen's team discovered a group text chain among senior officers coordinating story alignments after controversial incidents. They found unofficial quotas targeting specific neighborhoods and performance evaluations that rewarded aggressive enforcement in minority communities. In the police academy's records office, an instructor pulled out old training logs. Reynolds' psychological evaluation from 15 years ago noted concerns about his responses to stress and authority challenges. The notes had been overruled by a supervisor who needed to fill academy slots. As evening fell, Detective Chen pinned another document to her investigation board, a photo of Reynolds at a department award ceremony 5 years ago, receiving a commendation for proactive policing. Standing beside him, smiling and shaking his hand, was Chief Wilson himself. In the background, barely visible, was a young Officer Martinez, her face showing the first signs of the concern that would eventually break the wall of silence. Cedar Grove's community center hadn't seen this many people since the hurricane evacuation 3 years ago. The emergency town hall meeting drew crowds that spilled onto the sidewalk, their angry voices filtering through the building's aged walls. Inside, Mayor Sandra Chen gripped the podium, watching her childhood hometown tear itself apart. My brother served with Lieutenant Carter, a young woman in military fatigues declared, her voice cutting through the chaos. He's the kind of officer who stays late to help junior enlisted with their paperwork. Meanwhile, your Officer Reynolds has a history of complaints longer than my deployment record. From the back, auto shop owner Rick Delaney stood up, his work uniform still stained with grease. My daddy was a cop for 30 years. You people don't understand the split-second decisions they have to make. Reynolds has protected this town for 15 years. Now you want to crucify him over one mistake. The crowd erupted again, but a surprise speaker silenced the room. Dana Reynolds walked slowly to the microphone, her hands shaking as she smoothed her nurse's scrubs. I've been an ER nurse at Cedar Grove Hospital for 20 years, she began, her voice barely steady. I've treated both victims of crime and officers injured in the line of duty. But I also watched my husband change over 15 years of police work. The room held its breath as she continued. The man who pepper-sprayed Lieutenant Carter isn't the same person who wanted to be a police officer to help people. The department failed him by ignoring his trauma, and they failed our community by letting it continue. Tears streamed down her face as she turned to Carter's family in the front row. I am so sorry for what he did to your son. Outside, two groups of protesters faced each other across Main Street. One side held signs supporting the police, while the other demanded reform. But the lines weren't as clear as the media wanted to paint them. A retired police sergeant stood with the reformers, holding a sign that read, "Good cops support accountability." Among the police supporters, an African-American business owner argued that defunding wasn't the answer. Better training and oversight were. At Cedar's Diner, the traditional cop hangout, owner Maria Gutierrez had removed the Blue Lives Matter flag she proudly displayed for years. My son is a police officer in Chicago, she explained to her regular customers. But he called me after seeing that video and said, "Mama, if we don't clean house, we lose the community's trust forever." The local high school became another battleground as students organized walkouts. Principal James Wright watched through his office window as teenagers who'd grown up together now stood on opposite sides of the parking lot. But then he noticed something the news cameras missed. After the protest, those same students met at the local park to talk, really talk, about their fears, experiences, and hopes for their town. Carter himself visited local churches, speaking not of revenge but reconciliation. This isn't about one officer or one incident, he told the congregation at First Baptist. This is about who we want to be as a community. His words reached Dana Reynolds, sitting quietly in the back pew, still wearing her hospital scrubs after a night shift. As the sun set on another tense day, Mohammed Patel stayed late at his gas station, now a makeshift community center. He served free coffee to both protesters and police officers, watching as occasional conversations sparked between unlikely pairs. In his native Afghanistan, he'd seen communities destroyed by division, but he'd also seen them heal, one difficult conversation at a time. Officer James Rodriguez stared at the anonymous note left in his locker. "Race traitor, remember which side you're on." He crumpled the paper and added it to his growing collection of threats since he'd started supporting the reform initiatives. As one of the few Latino officers in the department, he'd spent years staying quiet, trying to fit in. Now, watching younger officers choose sides, he realized silence was no longer an option. The mandatory bias training session felt like a battlefield. Half the chairs sat empty. Officers calling in sick in coordinated protest. Sergeant Sarah Miller, a 20-year veteran leading the training, faced the resistance head-on. "I've served with many of you for decades," she began, her voice firm. "But if we don't adapt, we're not just failing our community, we're failing ourselves." In the evidence room, IT specialist Kevin Park discovered his access code suddenly revoked. His investigation into deleted body camera footage had struck a nerve. Through the glass walls of his office, he watched senior officers huddle in whispered conversations, their eyes darting his way. That evening, he made 3 copies of his findings and mailed them to different journalists, just in case. Chief Wilson's reform proposals met with subtle sabotage at every turn. Body cameras malfunctioned at crucial moments. Community outreach meetings were scheduled at impossible times. Training sessions faced mysterious budget shortfalls. But a group of officers, led by Rodriguez and Miller, began documenting everything. They created a secure chat group called Change from Within, sharing evidence of the systematic resistance. Donna Reynolds emerged as an unexpected ally. Her nursing colleagues had initially shunned her, blaming her husband's actions for bringing shame to their town. But when she spoke at roll call about the mental health crisis among officers, sharing intimate details of Michael's descent into paranoia and bias, even the hardened veterans listened. "The old system didn't just fail our community," she said, her voice breaking. "It failed my husband." Lieutenant Carter's military unit provided crucial support. They shared their mandatory psychological evaluation protocols, their de-escalation training modules, their accountability systems. Colonel Martinez herself attended police commission meetings, challenging the old guard's resistance with hard data about successful military reforms. The younger officers found their voice. During a tense meeting about new use of force policies, rookie officer Sarah Chen stood up. "I didn't join the force to be part of a system that protects bad behavior," she declared, her hand shaking, but her voice steady. "I joined to protect and serve everyone, not just those who look like me." The resistance took creative forms. Anonymous complaints filed against reform-minded officers. Crucial paperwork mysteriously delayed. Patrol assignments suddenly changed to separate allies. But technology became their weapon. Reformers documented everything with phone cameras and hidden recorders, building a case against those obstructing change. Mohammed's gas station surveillance footage captured a disturbing pattern. Reform-supporting officers faced increased traffic stops when off-duty. Rodriguez found his personal vehicle vandalized, snitch scratched into the paint. But for every act of intimidation, community support grew stronger. Local businesses offered free meals to officers supporting change. Veterans stood guard outside reformers' homes. As the sun set on another challenging day, Officer Rodriguez sat in his patrol car, writing detailed notes about the resistance he'd witnessed. His phone buzzed with a message from the Change from Within group, another officer ready to break the silence. In his rearview mirror, he noticed a patrol car following him, its headlights menacing in the growing darkness. But this time, instead of fear, he felt resolve. The old system was dying, and its death throes couldn't stop the inevitable tide of change. The deposition room felt smaller than it actually was, its beige walls closing in as Michael Reynolds sat across from Lieutenant Carter's legal team. His own attorney had advised against this meeting, But Reynolds insisted. After 3 months of silence, he was ready to talk, not for legal strategy, but because the truth was eating him alive. It started 6 years ago, Reynolds began, his voice barely above a whisper. A domestic violence call. I arrived first. The guy had a gun. He paused, hands trembling as he reached for his water glass. I watched him shoot his wife before I could stop him. She looked just like my sister. Carter, sitting quietly in the corner, noticed how Reynolds' uniform hung loose on his frame, how dark circles shadowed his eyes. The decorated officer from his personnel photos was gone, replaced by a man haunted by his own demons. I requested counseling after that. Reynolds continued. They gave me 3 sessions and told me to man up. Said taking more would hurt my promotion chances. His voice cracked. I started seeing threats everywhere. Every traffic stop became a potential ambush. The department's solution was to transfer me to a less stressful patrol area, the predominantly minority neighborhoods. Dana Reynolds, who had insisted on being present, reached for her husband's hand. I tried to get him help privately, she added, but the police union insurance wouldn't cover it. They said seeking mental health treatment could be used against him in the field. The revelation sparked something unexpected in Carter. As a military officer, he'd seen countless soldiers struggle with PTSD, receiving support and treatment without stigma. In the Army, he found himself saying, "We have mandatory counseling after critical incidents. It's seen as maintenance, like cleaning your weapon." Reynolds looked up, meeting Carter's eyes for the first time. "The night I stopped you," he said, "I just handled another domestic call. Different situation, but something triggered me. I couldn't shake the memory of that woman dying. When you reached for your registration," he trailed off, the weight of his actions visible in his slumped shoulders. Carter's attorney, Marcus Thompson, placed a thick folder on the table. "We've uncovered 17 other officers in your department with similar experiences," he said. "Critical incidents, inadequate support, escalating behavior. The system didn't just fail you, it created you." The department psychologist's records told a damning story. Officers reporting trauma were labeled sensitive or weak. Those who persisted in seeking help found themselves assigned to night shifts or dangerous areas. The message was clear: bury it and move on. A knock at the door interrupted them. Detective Sarah Chen entered with new evidence. Internal memos showing department leadership had repeatedly rejected federal grants for mental health programs, fearing it would make their officers soft. As the afternoon wore on, the discussion shifted from personal accountability to systemic failure. Carter shared stories of military mental health protocols, while Reynolds revealed the unofficial department motto, "Suck it up or ship out." The legal proceedings were no longer just about one incident. They'd uncovered a culture of neglect that transformed traumatized officers into ticking time bombs. Carter's military experience offered a blueprint for change: regular psychological evaluations, peer support programs, trauma-informed leadership. As the sun set outside the deposition room window, Carter and Reynolds found themselves talking not as adversaries, but as 2 men who'd seen different sides of the same broken system. Their conversation laid the groundwork for what would become a revolutionary approach to police mental health support, though neither of them knew it yet. 2 years after the incident, Carter parked his car at the same gas and go where everything had started. The station looked different now. A community bulletin board covered one wall, filled with flyers for police community meetings and mental health resources. Mohammed had turned it into a symbol of transformation, a place where officers and residents could grab coffee and actually talk. Inside, rookie officers gathered for their weekly community engagement training. Carter, now a captain, stood beside Michael Reynolds, both men in civilian clothes. They'd spent the past year traveling to police departments across the country, sharing their story and the reforms it inspired. "I almost didn't come back here," Reynolds admitted to the group, gesturing at the spot where he'd once stood with pepper spray in hand. "But avoiding it meant other officers would repeat my mistakes." His hands were steady now, his eyes clear. 2 years of proper therapy and support had worked wonders. The Cedar Grove Police Department had become a national model for reform. The changes weren't just procedural, they were cultural. Every officer now had mandatory counseling sessions, not as punishment, but as routine maintenance. Critical incident teams included mental health professionals. The department's peer support program, led by Dana Reynolds, had helped dozens of officers address trauma before it turned toxic. Officer Rodriguez, recently promoted to sergeant, shared data from the past 2 years. Use of force incidents down 70%, community complaints reduced by 65%, and officer retention improved by 80%. But the most striking change was in officer mental health. Requests for counseling had increased 5-fold as the stigma disappeared. "The military taught me that strength isn't about being bulletproof," Carter told the rookies. "It's about knowing when to ask for help." He noticed several veterans among them, drawn to law enforcement by Cedar Grove's new approach to mental health and community relations. Mohammed's teenage son, Ahmed, now worked part-time at the station while studying criminal justice. He'd been inspired by watching the transformation of his community. "My father always said the gas station was like a mirror," Ahmed shared. It reflected both the worst and best of Cedar Grove. The lawsuit's settlement had gone beyond monetary compensation. It established the Carter Reynolds Initiative, a foundation providing mental health support for law enforcement nationwide. The program combined military trauma protocols with community oversight, creating a model other departments eagerly adopted. Sarah Chen, now Chief of Internal Affairs, had implemented a revolutionary transparency program. Body camera footage was regularly reviewed not for punishment, but for signs of officer stress and trauma. Early intervention had prevented countless potential incidents. As the training session ended, Carter noticed an unexpected visitor, his mother. She'd been hesitant about his continued involvement with police reform, fearing for his safety. But watching him turn trauma into transformation had changed her perspective. She now led a support group for families of both officers and victims of police incidents. Reynolds checked his watch. Time for his weekly therapy session. 2 years ago, this would have been a career killer. Now, it was as routine as qualifying at the shooting range. Who would have thought, he mused to Carter, that the worst night of our lives would lead to this? Outside, the sun set on a changed Cedar Grove. The gas station's lights illuminated a new generation of officers chatting with community members over coffee. Carter's phone buzzed. Another department requesting their training program. He smiled, remembering something Mohammed had told him. Sometimes the best bridges are built where walls once stood. As Carter and Reynolds left together, their shadows merged under the gas and go sign. No longer victim and aggressor, but partners in a revolution of reform. Behind them, Ahmed turned on the station's lights, illuminating the bulletin board's latest edition. Community Police Academy graduation. All welcome.